The wind on the ridge didn't just howl, it spoke. It carried a sound that was half a human cry and half the shriek of something ancient and angry, a sound stitched into the groaning of old-growth pines as snow fell thick and slow. This was the kind of night that buried the world, the kind of night where even the hungriest wolves stayed close to their dens, where the stars hid their faces in shame, and the land itself seemed to forget it had ever known the sun. But something moved against the whiteout, a tall figure, cloaked in fur, and a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. His boots left deep prints in the snow, prints that the wind tried to erase the moment they were made. His name was Takakota, but he hadn't used it much in years. His tongue knew two languages, the one of his people and the one of the settlers, but he'd grown tired of them both. Words were just tools, and he'd seen them used for nothing but lies and broken promises. War made them useless. Peace made them poisonous. So he'd built a life in the quiet. His cabin was tucked deep in the pines, far from the ridge, a place where men forgot to look, and even ghosts felt unwelcome. He wasn't looking to be a hero that night. He wasn't looking to save anyone. He had followed no trail, heard no name called on the wind. There was only that sound, that broken cry that felt like a bone snapping deep inside his own chest. Something he thought he'd buried 3 winters ago, right alongside his wife and daughter, stirred in the darkness. It turned his feet toward the sound, and he began to walk. He found her half buried under a snowdrift, a crumpled shape that was almost one with the landscape. Her skin had the mottled gray color of death's first touch. She was young, no older than his daughter would have been, wrapped in the tattered remains of a doken shawl. One moccasin was gone, her bare foot a sickly blue. Her hair had been hacked off, short and uneven, as if with a dull blade in a fit of rage. Dark bruises painted her wrists like storm clouds that would never pass. Her lips were blue, her body still. He thought he was too late. He knelt beside her, the cold seeping through his leggings, and reached out a hand. He expected her skin to be as cold as the stone beneath the snow. But as his fingers brushed her cheek, her eyes flickered open. Just for a second. There was no fear in them, no surprise, just a flat, hollow resignation. She looked at him the way one looks at the final, killing frost of winter, expected but unwelcome all the same. She was ready to die. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer one. He simply wrapped her in the heavy buffalo hide he wore, the one that had once belonged to his daughter. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, less than a memory. He turned his back to the wind and began the long, slow walk down the ridge, carrying the dying girl away from the grave she had chosen. The cabin was waiting. It stood low and crooked by a frozen stream, its roof sagging under the weight of forgotten seasons. It wasn't a home, not really. It was just a place he existed, a place he mended tools and tried to forget his dreams. Inside, it smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and old leather. He laid her down gently on a pallet of furs near the central fire pit. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, building the fire up from embers to a steady blaze, as if warming her spirit might coax it to stay in a body that had already given up. She didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, a tiny puff of condensation in the cold air. Takakota brewed a strong tea from willow bark and dried mint leaves, the scent filling the small space. He sat on a stool across from her and waited. The firelight danced across her face, carving her features into a mask that was not quite alive, but not quite dead either. Her jaw was clenched tight, as if she were still bracing herself against the world, even in unconsciousness. It was then that he saw it, a detail he had missed in the swirling snow. On the inside of her wrist, just below the ugly purple bruise, was a scar. It wasn't a random mark from a fall or a fight. It was a brand, a perfect circle with a jagged line through the middle, seared into her flesh. It was no woman's scar of despair. It was the mark of ownership, the kind of mark a rancher burns into cattle. He didn't sleep that night. He sat and watched her, humming an old song under his breath, a melody without words that his mother had sung when his little sister was burning with fever. It was a song of holding on. Outside, the storm rattled the roof like a bag of bones. The cabin creaked and groaned around them. At dawn, the snow was still falling, but it was softer now, tired. He fed the fire again, and then, moved by an instinct he didn't understand, he reached for her hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but they twitched in his grasp. He leaned closer. Her eyelids, swollen and dark, cracked open. For a long moment her gaze was unfocused, lost. Then her eyes found him. She flinched, a sharp, violent jerk, trying to pull away. "It's all right," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting in a riverbed. "You're safe." She blinked once, her gaze darting around the strange cabin, then back to his face. Her lip trembled. A single choked sound escaped her throat. Then she whispered two words that turned the night's rescue into a dark mystery. "He's coming." She fell back into sleep then. Not the desperate, shallow sleep of before, but a deeper, warmer sleep. One that trusted, for now, that she might be allowed to wake up again. Takakota sat back, resting his arms on his knees, his mind racing. He's coming, not they. He, a single person. Who was he? The man who had beaten her? The man who had branded her? And why did that brand look so terrifyingly familiar? He stared at the floorboards, not at her. He understood hiding. He understood shame. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't a woman fleeing from tribal justice. This was a woman fleeing from a monster, and he had just brought her right into his own home. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was gathering in the silence of that cabin. For 3 days, the girl drifted in and out of consciousness. The world outside remained a wall of white, the snow piling up in massive drifts, sealing them off from everything. Takakota moved with a quiet efficiency that bordered on ritual. He hunted silently, a shadow in the white woods, bringing back rabbits for a thin, warm broth that he fed to her from a cracked tin cup. He dressed the wounds on her wrists and ankles. He never spoke unless necessary. She never asked where she was. She never asked who he was. That suited him just fine. Anonymity was a kind of armor for them both. But her presence changed the cabin. It was no longer just a shell where a man waited to die. The air was now shared. A second heartbeat, however faint, echoed his own. On the 3rd day, she woke up, and this time she stayed awake. Her eyes were clear, the fever gone. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her gaze sharp and assessing. She looked at him, at the fire, at the sturdy walls of the cabin. "They said I brought shame," she said, her voice raspy but firm. He was mending the handle of his axe by the hearth, the rhythmic scrape of his knife the only sound. He didn't look up. He just kept working. "I loved someone," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames, as if the story were written there. "Someone my people hated, a white man. When he was done with me, my family stripped me of my name. They said I should offer myself to the frost for my sins." She paused, her breath hitching. "I walked for 2 days. I thought maybe dying would be cleaner." The story was clean, it was simple. It was the kind of tragedy that happened all too often in these fractured lands. It explained the hacked hair, the torn shawl, the exile. It almost explained everything, but it didn't explain the brand. He still didn't raise his eyes from his work. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, Takakota spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "You didn't die." Her eyes flicked to his, surprised by the response. "That counts for something," he said, and for the first time since he'd found her, something in her face softened. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but the tight, brittle lines around her mouth released, just a little. Later that evening, he left a pair of thick wool stockings and a worn but clean pair of moccasins by her pallet. They had been his daughters. Wiaka, she had finally whispered her name to him, looked at them like a child seeing a precious gift for the first time. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The fire burned brighter that night, not because he fed it more wood, but because for the first time in 3 long years, someone else breathed beside it with a flicker of hope. The next morning she woke to find the cabin empty. Panic, sharp and cold, flared in her chest. She scrambled to the door, her heart pounding. Had he left her? Had he changed his mind? She pushed the heavy door open and saw him sitting on a log, carving a piece of wood with a calm, steady hand. The snow had stopped falling. The world was a blanket of pristine white, but the sky above was cracked open with the palest, most hopeful shade of blue. She stepped outside slowly, her breath a swirling cloud in the frigid air. She sat on the other end of the log. "What are you carving?" she asked, her voice quiet. He held it up, a small, intricately detailed horse, the kind you would give a child. "Why?" she whispered. He looked off toward the silent, snow-laden pines. "It's a habit." She nodded, accepting the simple, incomplete answer. After a long pause, she spoke again. "My real crime," she began, and his hands stilled. "It wasn't that I loved him. It was that he was the son of a very powerful man, a man named Elias Thorne." Takakota's head snapped up. His eyes, which had been calm and distant, were suddenly flint hard. The name hung in the air between them like the frozen blade of a guillotine. Elias Thorne, the land baron, the man who owned the valley, the mines, the town, and every politician in a 100-mile radius, the man who had systematically and ruthlessly driven Takakota's people from their ancestral lands. "The brand," Takakota said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's Thorne's brand, the circle T." Wiaka nodded, pulling back her sleeve to reveal the ugly puckered scar. "His son, Julian. He didn't love me. He owned me. When he grew tired of me, he had his father's men dispose of me. They beat me and left me for the snow. It was cleaner than a bullet." Suddenly, the simple story of a shamed girl became something far more sinister. This wasn't about a broken heart. This was about power, cruelty, and a man who treated people like property. Takakota looked at the brand on her wrist, and then at the small wooden horse in his hand. The toy suddenly felt heavy, a relic from a life Thorne had destroyed. He realized with a sickening lurch that he hadn't just saved a random girl from the storm. The storm had brought him the one person who could burn Elias Thorne's entire empire to the ground. And the men who had left her for dead would not be happy to learn that their work was incomplete. They would be coming back to finish the job. The thaw came slowly, but the town's suspicion came fast. It started with whispers from the kitchen of old Maeve, the herbalist widow who lived on the edge of the settlement. Words passed over sacks of flour and bundles of dried roots, spreading like a contagion. "He's keeping her," they said. "A Comanche ghost and a cast-out girl, holed up in that cabin on the ridge." No one had seen Wiaka since the winter had swallowed her whole. They had assumed she was dead, a fitting end for a girl who brought shame upon her people. It was a neat, tidy story, one that reinforced their grim sense of order. But Maeve's visit to the cabin, whether innocent or not, had loosened a thread, and now the whole town was pulling on it. Takakota felt the change in the air before he heard the talk. The woods grew more silent, more watchful. The squirrels vanished. The deer kept to the deepest shadows. Even the crows, those black-winged heralds of change, seemed to circle his cabin in tighter, more curious spirals. Wiaka, for her part, tried to build a life within the 4 walls of the cabin. She had found a strange peace in the quiet rhythm of their days. She swept the floor. She boiled snow for washing. She found a length of rawhide and wrapped it around her wrist, covering the brand, hiding the truth of her past, not from Takakota, but from herself. She caught him watching her once, his gaze lingering on the rawhide bracelet. There was no pity in his eyes, only a deep, unsettling memory. That afternoon, he left a small pouch on her pallet. Inside were dyed sinew threads, polished bone beads, and several chips of brilliant turquoise. "Yours now," was all he said, "if you want to make again." Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers curled around the pouch as if it were a living thing. That night, by the light of the fire, she began to sew again, her fingers moving with a forgotten grace, stitching intricate patterns onto a piece of scrap leather. The act of creating something beautiful was a quiet rebellion against the ugliness that had been done to her. But the world outside their sanctuary was not content to leave them be. One afternoon, Wiyaka found it, a crude sign nailed to a pine tree just down the slope from the cabin. 3 words, painted in what looked like pig's blood. Thorn's property. Return. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The snow under her feet was soft, a sign of a premature spring, but a deep, unshakable cold settled in her bones. This wasn't the town's prejudice. This was a direct message. Thorn knew she was alive. Takakota found her there, her shoulders rigid. He didn't ask what was wrong. He read the words on the sign. Then, without a sound, he walked forward, gripped the board with both hands, and with a guttural roar, tore it from the tree. He didn't burn it. He smashed it into splinters against a rock, and then buried the pieces deep under the snow. "They think I'm an object," she whispered that evening, her voice trembling. "Something to be returned." "Then let them come and try to claim you," he said, his eyes hard as stone as he stared into the fire. Their fragile peace was shattered for good a few days later. Sheriff Darnell came up the trail, his boots heavy with purpose. He wasn't wearing his badge on his chest. It gleamed quietly from the holster on his hip. He was a big man, with a jaw that looked like it had been clenched his entire life. "Takakota," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He stopped just beyond the fire pit, his eyes flicking from Takakota to Wiyaka, who stood near the cabin door. "Heard you found something up here that doesn't belong to you." Takakota continued carving the piece of wood in his hands, not looking up. "She's no one's," he said. Darnell let out a short, ugly laugh. "That's not what Elias Thorne says. He says a piece of his property went missing, a valuable piece. He's offering a reward for its return, no questions asked." He looked directly at Wiyaka then. "You've caused a lot of trouble, girl. It's time to go back where you belong." "I belong here," Wiyaka said, her voice shaking but clear. "This man can't protect you," Darnell sneered. "Thorne owns this valley. He owns me. He owns the ground you're standing on. You think this little cabin is a fortress?" Takakota finally stood up. He was taller than the sheriff, his shoulders wider than a doorway. He didn't say a word, just fixed Darnell with a look so cold and final that the sheriff instinctively took a step back. "She stays," Takakota said. "This is your last chance," Darnell warned, his hand drifting toward the butt of his pistol. "Thorne's not a patient man. His son, Julian, is getting anxious. He wants his pet back." The mention of Julian's name made Wiyaka flinch, but then something inside her snapped. The fear that had lived in her gut for months turned to ice-cold rage. "Tell Julian," she said, stepping forward, "that his pet has grown teeth." Darnell stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, surprised by her defiance. Then his face twisted into a mask of contempt. He nodded once, a slow, bitter gesture. "Have it your way," he spat, and turned without another word, his heavy boots crunching angrily in the snow as he retreated down the path. When he was gone, a heavy silence fell over the clearing. "They'll be back," Wiyaka said, stating the obvious. "I know," Takakota replied. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. What did he mean, valuable piece? It's not just you they want, is it? You took something from them. Wiyaka looked down at her hands, at the beading she had been working on. The beautiful patterns suddenly seemed frivolous, childish. The time for hiding was over. "Yes," she whispered, finally meeting his gaze. "I took something. It wasn't mine to take, but it wasn't theirs to keep either." She took a deep breath. "Before I ran, I stole a book from Thorne's study, his private ledger." Takakota's eyes widened. A man like Thorne would have 2 sets of books, one for the taxman and one for the truth. A ledger like that would be his entire empire's death warrant. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. She looked around the clearing at the towering pines, at the endless snow. "I buried it," she said, "somewhere out there. I was so scared and cold I can't remember the exact spot, but it's here, on this mountain." Suddenly, it all made sense. The brand, the hunt, the reward, they didn't just want her silence. They wanted the proof of their crimes. Takakota looked from her face to the vast, snow-covered wilderness that surrounded them. They were sitting on a powder keg, and Sheriff Darnell had just lit the fuse. The ledger was their only weapon, but it was lost somewhere in a frozen wasteland, and Thorne's men were coming to burn it all to the ground. The sky darkened too fast that evening, the clouds crawling in low and heavy, like a shroud being lowered over the valley. The air grew thick and still, carrying the scent of smoke before there was any flame. It was the kind of weather that felt like a warning. Inside the cabin, the tension was a living thing. Wiaka knelt on the floor, her hands idle in her lap, the unfinished beadwork forgotten. The knowledge that the ledger was out there, buried somewhere beneath the snow, was a constant gnawing pressure. It was their only hope, and it was lost. Takakota was outside, splitting wood. The rhythmic thud of his axe was usually a comforting sound, but tonight it sounded like a funeral drum. He paused mid-swing, his head lifting. He sniffed the air, his eyes fixed on the winding path that led down the slope. It was the same path the deer had been avoiding for weeks. Then he heard it. Not the crunch of a single pair of boots, but the muffled tread of many. Hoofbeats. Men on horseback, moving with a grim purpose. Within minutes, they crested the hill. It was Sheriff Darnell, and this time he had company. Not just a couple of deputies, but a dozen men, their faces hard and grim in the fading light. They weren't lawmen. They were a posse. Hired guns, their rifles held loosely but ready. At the center of the group, sitting on a fine black stallion, was a young man with an arrogant sneer and cold, empty eyes. Julian Thorne. Takakota met them in the center of the clearing, his axe held loosely in one hand. He stood as still as a stone monolith, a silent challenge. "Evening, Takakota," Julian called out, his voice smooth and laced with contempt. "I've come for my property." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "She's not property," Takakota said, his voice a low growl. Julian laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "Oh, but she is, and she stole something else from me, something far more valuable. A little book. I want it back, and I want her back." The cabin door creaked open. Wiaka stepped out, her chin held high, the beaded shawl she'd made wrapped around her shoulders. She looked directly at Julian, her face a pale, determined mask. "I don't have it," she lied, her voice clear and steady. "Don't you?" Julian's smile widened. He dismounted, walking slowly toward her. "You were always a terrible liar, my dear. You have one chance. Give me the ledger, and I'll let your new friend here live. I might even be merciful with you. A quick end instead of a slow one." "The book is gone," Takakota said, stepping between them. "Lost to the snow. Is that so?" Julian stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Then I guess we'll just have to warm this place up until you remember where you put it?" He turned to his men. "Burn it." One of the men dismounted, a torch already in his hand. He lit it from a lantern, the flame sputtering to life, casting dancing, monstrous shadows across the snow. The man started walking toward the cabin. Takakota didn't move. He didn't raise his axe. He just watched the man with the torch approach. Wiaka's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end. But then, a new sound cut through the tense silence. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding as a whip crack. "You'll do no such thing, Julian Thorne." Everyone turned. Standing at the edge of the woods, a long rifle held expertly in her hands, was old Maeve, the herbalist. But the woman who stood there now was no simple gatherer of roots. Her eyes were chips of flint, and her posture radiated an authority that made even Julian Thorne pause. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, melting out of the trees, were a dozen figures, silent and armed. Men and women from the tribes Thorn had displaced, people who had lost everything to him. Julian stared, his arrogant sneer faltering for the first time. "What is this?" "This is a reckoning," Maeve said, her voice ringing through the clearing. "We've been watching you, waiting. We knew you'd get sloppy. We knew you'd come for her." She looked at Wiaka, and her gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "And we knew about the ledger." The man with the torch stopped, looking nervously between Julian and Maeve's armed group. The odds had just shifted dramatically. Julian's face contorted in a snarl of rage. "You think a bunch of angry savages can stop me?" "We're not going to stop you," a deep voice said from behind Maeve. A tall, grim-faced man stepped forward, his eyes locked on Takakota. "He is." The man pointed toward Takakota's cabin. "The ledger isn't buried in the snow," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's not lost." Wiaka and Takakota exchanged a look of pure confusion. What was he talking about? "That girl was clever," the man continued, a slow smile spreading across his face. "But not as clever as she thinks. She didn't bury the book. She hid it, right under your nose." He gestured again at the cabin. "It's in the floorboards, under the hearthstone." A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Wiaka. It was true. In her panicked flight, she hadn't trusted the ground. She had pried up the heavy stone in front of the fire pit and shoved the ledger into the dark space beneath, praying it would be safe. Julian's eyes lit up with a triumphant, evil glee. "Well, well, well," he purred. "It seems my property is more valuable than I thought." He turned to his men, his confidence restored. "Forget the girl for now. Get the book, tear that shack apart." The gunmen surged forward, ignoring Maeve's group, their focus now entirely on the cabin. This was no longer about retrieving a person. It was about destroying evidence. Takakota and Wiaka were suddenly alone, standing between a dozen armed men and the one thing that could save them. Maeve and her people were too far away to help in time. The trap hadn't been for Julian. It had been for them. The resistance hadn't come to save them. They had used them as bait. They had sacrificed them to locate the ledger. And now, Thorn's men were about to storm the cabin and retrieve the only weapon that could bring him down. The gunmen swarmed toward the cabin like hungry dogs, their boots churning the snow into a muddy mess. Julian Thorn stood back, a smug, victorious smile on his face. He had won. The ledger was his. But Takakota didn't move to defend the door. He didn't raise his axe. Instead, he grabbed Wayaka's arm. "This way! Now!" he yelled, pulling her away from the cabin toward the dense line of pines at the back of the clearing. "What are you doing?" she cried, stumbling after him. "The ledger!" "The ledger was never the weapon!" he shouted back over the rising noise of the men breaking down his door. "It was the bait!" They plunged into the darkness of the woods, just as the first of Thorn's men kicked the cabin door off its hinges. They could hear shouts of triumph from within, followed by the sound of splintering wood and the heavy scrape of the hearthstone being moved. "They have it!" Wiaka gasped, her heart sinking. "It's over." "No," Takakota said, pulling her behind a massive, snow-covered boulder. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes were alive with a fire she had never seen before. "It's just beginning." From inside the cabin came a triumphant yell. "Got it! We've got the book!" And then, the world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the valley, a sound so immense it shook the very ground beneath their feet. A brilliant flash of orange and white light erupted from the cabin, blowing the walls outward in a shower of fiery splinters. The roof was launched into the sky, a spinning disk of flame, before disintegrating into nothing. The shockwave hit them like a physical blow, knocking the air from their lungs and sending a wave of superheated air and snow blasting through the trees. Wiaka stared in stunned silence at the blazing inferno where the cabin had been just seconds before. The men who had been inside were gone, vaporized. The men outside had been thrown back like dolls, their bodies twisted and broken in the snow. Julian Thorn, who had been standing a safe distance away, was on his hands and knees, staring in disbelief at the raging fire. His perfect hair was singed, his face blackened with soot. Wiyaka turned to Takakota, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "What? What was that?" Takakota reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. It was one of his carvings, a little wooden horse, just like the one he had shown her before. But this one was different. It was hollow, and from a small hole in its belly, a thin wisp of smoke curled into the cold night air. "You asked me what I was carving," he said, his voice grim. "It's a habit. I spent 3 years planning my revenge on Elias Thorne. I knew his men would come for me eventually. I packed the foundation of that cabin with every stick of dynamite I could buy or steal from his mines." He looked at the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "I never cared about the ledger," he said. "The book was just paper. It could be burned. It could be lost." He held up the carving. "I just needed a reason for them to all gather in one place. You gave me that reason." The horrifying truth settled over her. He hadn't been a hermit, grieving in silence. He had been a hunter, a patient, methodical hunter, building his trap piece by piece. The cabin wasn't his home. It was a bomb, and he had been waiting for the perfect moment to light the fuse. The resistance group, led by Maeve, was now moving through the clearing, their faces grimly satisfied as they surveyed the carnage. They hadn't sacrificed Takakota and Wiyaka. They had been in on the plan all along. They had provided the final piece of the puzzle, the false information about the ledger's location, to ensure Julian's men would all rush into the trap. Julian Thorne scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of insane rage and terror. He saw Maeve approaching, her rifle leveled at his chest. He turned and ran, a panicked, wounded animal, disappearing into the dark woods. "Let him go," Takakota said, his voice cold. "Let him run back to his father. Let him tell him what happened here tonight. Let him tell him that the ghosts of the people he destroyed are coming for him." He looked at Wiyaka, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the past 3 years in his eyes. The grief was still there, but it was now forged into something harder, sharper. It was the look of a man who had found his purpose again. But as she looked at the burning ruins of the cabin, a new, terrifying thought struck her. The trap had worked perfectly. Julian's men were dead. But the ledger, the only hard proof of Elias Thorne's crimes, had been in that cabin. "The book," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Takakota, the ledger. It's gone. It burned with everything else. He had sacrificed the evidence. He had chosen bloody revenge over justice. Without that book, Thorne was untouchable. He could deny everything. He could claim it was a tragic accident, a gas leak, anything. He could rebuild, hire new men, and come back for them with the full force of his wealth and power. Takakota's plan had been brilliant. It had been devastating. But in his thirst for vengeance, he might have just doomed them all. The fire roared, consuming the last remnants of the cabin, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like accusing fingers. Maeve and her fighters fanned out, securing the perimeter, their faces grim. The immediate threat was gone, but the war was far from over. "It burned," Wiyaka repeated, her voice hollow. "The proof. We have nothing now." Takakota looked at her, his face a stone mask in the firelight. He didn't speak. He simply reached into the deep inner pocket of his fur cloak. His hand emerged holding a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. With steady fingers, he untied the leather thong and unfolded the covering. Inside, nestled safely against the soft leather, was a small, black-bound book. Wiyaka stared at it, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. "How?" she stammered. "You said it was under the hearthstone." "That's what I needed them to believe," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "That's what Maeve's man told them. It was the only way to get them all inside." He looked down at the ledger in his hand. "When you told me where you hid it, I went back that same night while you were sleeping. I dug it up. I couldn't risk leaving it there." He had lied. To her, to everyone. He had played a game so deep and so dangerous that no one knew all the pieces. He had used her story, her fear, and the Resistance's desire for the ledger to fuel his own personal, explosive revenge, all while secretly protecting the one thing that could truly destroy Thorn. It wasn't just vengeance, it was strategy. Cold, calculated, and absolutely brutal. Maeve walked over to them, her rifle resting in the crook of her arm. She nodded at the ledger in Takakota's hand. I should have known you had another card to play. You were always 2 steps ahead. Thorn is a snake, Takakota said. You don't kill a snake by showing it a piece of paper. You cut off its head. Julian was the head. Julian was the son, Maeve corrected him gently. Elias is the snake, and he's still alive. When word of this gets back to him, he won't send a posse. He'll send an army. Let him, Takakota said. He handed the ledger to Maeve. This is what you wanted. Use it. Take it to the federal marshals in the capital. Show them the truth of what he's been doing in this valley. Maeve took the book with a reverent gravity. This will change everything, but it will take time, and Thorn won't give us that time. He'll hunt you both to the ends of the earth. We won't be here, Takakota said. He turned to Wayaka, his expression softening for the first time that night. The hard mask of the hunter fell away, revealing the man beneath. There's a place, a hidden canyon, 3 days' walk from here. My people used to call it the Valley of Whispering Waters. It's safe. We can disappear there. Wayaka looked from his face to the burning wreckage, then to the determined faces of Maeve's fighters. She had been running for so long. She had run from her tribe, from Julian, from the memory of her shame. The thought of running again made her feel tired, down to her bones. But then she looked at Takakota. He wasn't talking about running. He was talking about surviving. He was offering not a hiding place, but a home. Before she could answer, one of Maeve's scouts came running from the edge of the woods, his face pale with alarm. Riders! He yelled. A single rider coming fast from the west. It's not one of ours. Everyone froze. It was too soon for Thorn's men to be back. This was something else. Takakota instinctively pushed Wayaka behind him, his eyes scanning the darkness. Maeve raised her rifle, her fighters melting back into the shadows of the trees, weapons ready. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. A lone figure on a dark horse burst into the clearing, pulling the steed to a rearing halt just yards from the fire. The rider was wrapped in a heavy cloak, their face hidden by shadow. The figure slowly pushed back the hood of the cloak. It was a woman. An old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, her hair stark white against the dark fabric. She was from Wayaka's tribe. It was the elder, Kenna, the very woman who had pronounced the sentence of exile upon her. Wayaka, the old woman said, her voice cracking with an emotion Wayaka couldn't place. She ignored everyone else, her eyes locked on the girl she had cast out into the snow. What are you doing here? Wayaka demanded, stepping out from behind Takakota, her own voice filled with the bitterness of her betrayal. I came to warn you, Kenna said, her gaze filled with a terrible sadness. Our shaman had a vision of fire and blood on this mountain. She looked at the smoldering ruins. It seems he was right. A little late for warnings, Maeve said dryly, but the elder shook her head. The vision wasn't about this night. This was only the beginning. The fire, the blood. It was for him. She raised a trembling hand and pointed, not at Takakota, but past him, into the darkness. The man you call Thorn is not who you think he is, Kenna said, her voice dropping to a whisper. His family did not come from the east, like the other settlers. They came from the north, long ago. He is not just a land baron. He is the last descendant of the Wendigo clan. A cold dread, far deeper and more ancient than the fear of any man, settled over the clearing. The Wendigo, a name from dark legends. A tribe of cannibals and skinwalkers, thought to have been wiped out generations ago. That's just a story, one of Maeve's men muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Is it? Kenna asked, her dark eyes burning with intensity. His thirst for land is not for wealth. It is for blood. He feeds on the conflict, on the suffering. The men he hires, the ones who follow him without question, they are his kin. And you, she said, her gaze falling on Wayaka, you carry his blood. That is why you were cast out, not for loving an enemy, but for being the daughter of a monster. The final, most terrible secret was out. Wayaka stumbled back, the ground seeming to fall away beneath her feet. Her father wasn't just a cruel man. He was something else, something not entirely human. Kenna's face crumpled in shame. We were wrong to cast you out. We should have protected you. We should have fought him then. Now he knows you have allied with his enemies. He will not just hunt you. He will consume you. He will perform the old rituals. He will come for you with a power you cannot imagine. As if summoned by her words, a howl echoed from the distant peaks. It was not the cry of a wolf. It was a long, guttural, human-like scream filled with unnatural hunger and rage. It was the sound of a predator that had just had its kill stolen. It was the sound of Elias Thorne. The fighters looked at each other, their modern rifles suddenly feeling like children's toys against a threat that belonged to the age of myth. Maeve stared into the darkness, her face grim. Federal marshals can't fight a demon. Takakota looked at the ledger, then at Wayaka, who was pale and shaking. His plan had been to fight a man, a greedy, evil man. But not this. He had blown up a cabin full of hired guns, only to awaken a slumbering nightmare from the dawn of time. And that nightmare was coming for them. The howl echoed again, closer this time. The weight of the old woman's revelation pressed down on the clearing, heavier than any snowstorm. The fire, which had been a symbol of victory, now seemed small and pitiful against the encroaching darkness and the ancient evil it held. Elias Thorne wasn't just a man. He was a legacy of horror. The stories are true, Takakota said, his voice low. He was looking at the distant mountains, but his eyes were seeing something else, a memory from his childhood. My grandfather told me of them, the Wendigo, men who consumed the flesh of their enemies to steal their strength. He said they were all hunted down and destroyed. One survived, Kenna said, her voice trembling. He took a new name, a settler's name, and hid his nature behind wealth and power. But his bloodline remained. It remained in you, Wayaka. Wayaka felt a wave of nausea. The shame she had carried for loving Julian was nothing compared to this. The brand on her wrist was more than a mark of ownership. It was a symbol of a cursed lineage. This can't be. Your mother knew, Kenna continued, her voice filled with regret. She came to us after you were born, confessing everything. She had been seduced by Thorne's power, not knowing what he was. When she found out, she tried to flee with you, but he wouldn't let her go. She lived as his prisoner until her death. We kept her secret to protect the tribe from his wrath. We cast you out to protect you from your own blood. It was a cruel mercy, a kindness that felt like a damnation. They had sent her into the wilderness to save her from a monster, and she had run straight into the arms of his son. Maeve, ever the pragmatist, broke the spell. Stories or not, he's coming. That ledger, she said, patting the oilskin pouch, is more important than ever. It doesn't just prove his crimes against men, it gives the world a reason to believe the unbelievable. But we have to get it to the capital, and we have to keep you two alive. She turned to her fighters. Half of you will ride with me. We will take the low roads and draw as much attention as possible. We will be the bait. She looked at Takakota. The rest are yours. You will take the high passes, the old ways that only the tribes know. Take her to the Valley of Whispering Waters. Disappear until we send word. Takakota nodded, his face set like granite. The hunter's mask was back in place, but this time, he was not hunting a man. He was hunting a myth, or being hunted by one. We leave now, he commanded. 6 of Maeve's best fighters gathered around him, their faces grim but resolute. They were no longer just rebels fighting a land baron. They were warriors standing against a primal darkness. As Maeve's group prepared to ride out, Kenna dismounted and approached Wiaka. The old elder's face was etched with a deep, painful shame. "I carry the guilt of what we did to you. Take this," she said, pressing a small, intricately beaded amulet into Wiaka's hand. "It was your mother's. It is woven with charms of protection. It may not be much against him, but it is a piece of the love she had for you." Wiaka closed her fingers around the amulet. It was warm, as if it held the last traces of her mother's touch. For the first time, she didn't feel like Thorn's daughter. She felt like her mother's. "Go," Kenna whispered. "Live. That will be the greatest revenge." With a final, meaningful look at Takakota, Maeve spurred her horse and led her group away from the clearing, their hoofbeats a thundering promise of defiance disappearing into the east. Takakota turned to Wiaka and the small band of fighters. "The high passes are treacherous. We travel fast and light. We eat on the move. We don't light fires unless we have to. Stay close." He led them away from the carnage, plunging into the deep, dark woods to the north, climbing into the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the high country. For days, they moved like ghosts, speaking only in whispers, their feet finding paths that weren't on any map. The air grew thin and cold, and the silence of the high peaks was absolute. But they were not alone. On the third night, as they sheltered in a shallow cave overlooking a vast, moonlit valley, one of the warriors, a young man named Kichi, pointed to the valley floor below. "Look." Far below, a single point of light moved through the trees. A torch. But it moved with an unnatural speed, far faster than any man on foot or horseback could travel through such rough terrain. It darted and weaved through the forest like a hunting animal. "He knows we're here," Takakota breathed. "He's toying with us." They pressed on, their pace growing more desperate. The strain began to show on the fighters. Their resolute faces were now shadowed with a deep, primal fear. They had been trained to fight men, not specters. The next day, they found Kichi's body. He had been guarding their back trail. There were no tracks around him, no signs of a struggle. He was simply empty. His eyes were wide with a terror that had frozen on his face, and on his chest was a single bloody handprint, its fingers impossibly long and thin. Panic began to set in. One of the fighters, a man named Hinto, broke. "We can't fight this! It's a demon! We are all dead men!" "Hold yourself together!" Takakota roared, grabbing the man by his tunic. "Fear is what it feeds on. You show fear and you invite it in." But the damage was done. The seed of terror had been planted. That night they took shelter in a narrow gorge, the rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. It felt like a trap. Takakota knew they couldn't stay there, but his warriors were exhausted and demoralized. As Wiaka huddled against the cold stone, clutching her mother's amulet, she felt a strange sensation. The beads were growing warm in her hand. A faint, silvery light began to pulse from within the amulet, invisible to everyone but her. And with the light came a voice in her mind. Not a voice of words, but of feelings, of memories. Her mother's memories. She saw images flash through her consciousness. A hidden cave behind a waterfall, a secret symbol carved into a rock, a specific series of notes hummed like a lullaby. It wasn't a plan, it was a map left for her by her mother, a desperate breadcrumb trail leading to a place of power, a place where Thorn's ancient magic might have a weakness. "Takakota," she said, her voice urgent. "I know something. My mother, she left me something, a way. I think I know where we have to go." She described the images, the feelings, the half-remembered lullaby. Takakota listened intently, his eyes widening in recognition. "The Falls of the Ancestors," he whispered. "It's a sacred place, forbidden. It is said the spirits of the first people dwell there. No one has gone there in 100 years. "Then that's where we go," Wiaka said, a newfound strength in her voice. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a sliver of hope. She was no longer just the daughter of a monster. She was the daughter of a woman who had fought him. But as they prepared to leave the gorge, a chilling sound echoed from the entrance. A soft, wet, tearing sound. It was the sound of Hinto, the panicked warrior, being dragged into the darkness, his muffled screams cut short with a sickening crunch. The remaining 4 warriors stood paralyzed with fear. Thorn was no longer toying with them. He was picking them off one by one. He was hurting them. But was he hurting them away from the falls or towards them? Was Wayaka's vision a message of hope from her mother, or was it a trap laid by her father, using her own blood against her to lure them to their final doom? The path to the Falls of the Ancestors was a trial. They moved through the day and into the night, the remaining warriors growing more ragged and paranoid with every shadow. They knew they were being watched, stalked by something that defied all laws of nature. They finally reached the falls at dawn on the 5th day. It was a breathtaking sight. A massive curtain of water cascaded down a sheer cliff face into a deep turquoise pool, the mist creating a perpetual rainbow in the morning sun. According to the legends Takakota knew, this place was a gateway between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Following the memory map from the amulet, Wayaka led them along a treacherous, slippery ledge hidden behind the roaring waterfall. The sound was deafening, the spray soaking them to the bone. There, just as she had seen in her vision, was a cave. Carved above the entrance was a symbol, a spiral with 3 lines radiating from its center. The symbol of the first people. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The 3 remaining warriors refused to enter. "This place is tapu," one of them, a grim-faced man named Chaitin, said. "It is forbidden. We will stand guard here. We will face him as men, but we will not disturb the spirits." Takakota looked at Wayaka and nodded. This was their path to walk alone. They left the warriors at the entrance and stepped into the deep darkness of the cave. The air inside was still and ancient. It smelled of wet stone and something else, something electric and powerful. The cave opened into a large circular chamber. The walls were covered in ancient paintings, depicting strange celestial beings and great hunts of monstrous creatures. In the center of the chamber stood a single flat-topped stone altar, and lying on the altar, as if it had been placed there yesterday, was a spear. It was unlike any weapon Takakota had ever seen. The shaft was made of a dark, petrified wood that seemed to drink the light. The spearhead was not flint or obsidian, but a pale, milky white stone that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. It felt ancient, powerful, and alive. "My mother wanted me to find this," Wayaka whispered in awe. As Takakota reached out to touch the spear, a voice echoed through the chamber, seeming to come from the very rock around them. "To wield the sky piercer, one must pay a price." They spun around. An old man, impossibly ancient, sat in the shadows of the far wall. He was thin and frail, his skin like dried leather, but his eyes burned with a fierce intelligence. He was the guardian of the cave. "Who are you?" Takakota asked, his hand hovering over the spear. "I am the last one who remembers," the old man said. "I have waited a long time for someone worthy to come. The Wendigo has woken, and only a weapon of the spirits can send it back to the darkness." "What is the price?" Wayaka asked. "The spear demands a sacrifice," the guardian said, his eyes finding hers. "Not of blood, but of spirit. To kill the Wendigo, you must become a part of this place. The one who wields it will be bound to this cave, to this falls, forever. A life for a life, a guardian for a guardian." A terrible choice lay before them. To defeat Thorn, one of them would have to give up their life, their freedom, their future. They would become a ghost, a legend, a prisoner of this sacred place for all time. Suddenly, a scream tore through the roar of the waterfall from outside. It was Chaitin. Then another scream cut short. The warriors were dead. a shadow fell over the entrance to the cave. A tall, gaunt figure stood silhouetted against the bright mist of the falls. It was Elias Thorne, but he was no longer the handsome, cruel land baron. His body was twisted and elongated, his limbs unnaturally long and thin. His skin was the color of ash, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent red light, and his mouth was a blood-stained gash filled with sharpened teeth. "My daughter," the creature hissed, its voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "You have been so much trouble. And you," it said, its glowing eyes fixing on Takakota, "have cost me my son. I will feast on your bones." It took a step into the cave, and the ancient paintings on the walls seemed to recoil. "The price must be paid!" the guardian cried out. "He cannot be harmed by mortal means." Wiyaka looked at the spear, then at Takakota. She saw the future they could have had, a quiet life in a hidden valley, a life of healing and peace. And she saw him, a man who had already lost one family, ready to sacrifice himself for her. "No," she said, her voice firm. She stepped in front of him, facing the guardian. "He has already paid too much. The blood of the Wendigo is in me. The curse is mine to bear, and mine to end. I will pay the price." "Wiyaka, don't," Takakota pleaded, reaching for her. But she was already moving. She stepped to the altar and placed her hands on the pulsing, milky white spearhead. The moment her skin made contact, a blinding white light filled the cave. She cried out, not in pain, but in a surge of immense, overwhelming power. The light poured into her, flowing through her veins. The brand on her wrist burned away, replaced by the glowing spiral symbol of the first people. Her eyes began to glow with the same ethereal light as the spearhead. She turned to face her father, no longer just a frightened girl, but a vessel of ancient power, her face a mask of divine judgment. "You are not my father," she said, her voice echoing with the power of the spirits in the cave. "You are just a hungry ghost, and it is time for you to starve." She lifted the sky piercer. It was light as a feather in her hands. Thorn lunged, his claws extended, but he was too slow. Wiyaka moved with a preternatural grace, a blur of white light. She didn't just thrust the spear, she became the thrust. The weapon pierced the creature's chest, and the milky white spearhead erupted with a sun-bright flash. The Wendigo let out a horrific, soul-tearing shriek that was not of this world. Its body began to dissolve, not into blood and gore, but into black, foul-smelling smoke. The smoke was sucked into the spearhead, which glowed brighter and brighter until the creature was completely gone. The spear had not just killed it, it had consumed its evil essence, imprisoning it within the spirit stone. The light faded. The spear clattered to the stone floor. Wiyaka stood in the center of the cave, her body flickering, becoming translucent. The price was being paid. "Wiyaka!" Takakota cried, rushing to her side. His hands passed right through her. She smiled at him, a sad, beautiful smile. Her form was fading, becoming one with the light of the cave. "It's all right," her voice echoed around him. "My shame is gone. I'm home." Her spirit form drifted back toward the altar, her light merging with the paintings on the wall. She had become the new guardian. Takakota fell to his knees, his heart breaking for the second time in his life. He had won. They had saved the valley, saved the world from a creeping evil. But he had lost her. The old guardian put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do not grieve, warrior. She is not gone. She is a part of this place now. She has found her peace. Her sacrifice has consecrated this ground. No evil like the Wendigo will ever walk this land again." Takakota stood up slowly, his face etched with sorrow. He picked up the sky piercer. It was heavy now, just a spear made of wood and strange stone, its light extinguished. He walked to the cave entrance and looked out. The sun was high in the sky. The water of the falls sparkled and the world felt clean, new. He had a choice. He could stay, live a life of solitude near the falls, forever close to her spirit, or he could honor her sacrifice by living the life she had given back to him. He thought of Maeve, fighting the good fight in the world of men. He thought of the ledger and the justice it could bring. He thought of the people of the valley, now freed from a century-old curse. His fight wasn't over. Her sacrifice had to mean something in the world of the living, too. He turned and gave a final, solemn nod to the spirits in the cave. "Thank you," he whispered to the shimmering walls. Then he walked out from behind the waterfall, into the sunlight, leaving the ghost of the woman he loved to her eternal watch. He began the long walk down from the mountains, his heart heavy, but his purpose clear. He was no longer a hunter seeking revenge. He was a guardian, just like her, charged with protecting the future she had died to create. The story of the girl in the snow was over, but the legend of the guardian of the falls and the man from the mountain was just beginning. If you were captivated by this story of sacrifice and justice, and you want to hear more tales where forgotten heroes rise up to fight the darkness, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.